The Mafia boss found his first love inside a tiny cafe. She'd hidden his son for 7 years. He thought she was dead. She thought disappearing would keep their child alive. They were both wrong. And now every secret they buried is about to detonate in the same room. If this story already has your pulse running, hit that like button right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Stay with me until the end. You won't see the twist coming. The rain came down sideways that morning, the kind that found every gap in your collar and didn't apologize for it. Seattle in November wasn't a city so much as a punishment. Gray sky sitting flat and low over buildings that looked like they'd given up trying to be anything other than wet concrete and rusted steel. The streets near Garfield District were mostly empty at this hour, just delivery trucks grinding through standing water and the occasional figure hunched under an umbrella that the wind was already winning against. Ronan Viscari moved fast but not panicked. Panic was for men who hadn't already survived worse. He cut through the alley behind Clement Street with 2 of his remaining men, Decker on his left, Priest on his right, both of them bleeding from places they hadn't mentioned yet. The ambush at the waterfront had been precise, too precise. Whoever set it up knew his route, knew his window, knew that Tuesday morning was when he moved without the full detail. That meant someone close. That meant someone he'd eaten with. He didn't let himself finish the thought. Not yet. "We need a door," Decker said. "We need a hospital," Priest said. "We need to stop standing in the open," Ronan said, and that ended the conversation. The street they emerged onto was residential and half-forgotten, the kind of block that gentrification had eyed and then passed over in favor of something with better foot traffic. Old brownstones with fire escapes gone orange with rust, a laundromat with a handwritten sign in the window, a barbershop that looked like it hadn't changed a light bulb since 2003, and at the far end of the block, tucked between a shuttered dry cleaner and a vacant lot, a cafe so small it barely earned the name. The sign above the door was hand-lettered in dark green paint. Mercer's. The lights inside were on, warm yellow against all that gray. Ronan pushed through the door. The bell above it chimed once, soft and domestic and completely wrong for the moment. The cafe smelled like coffee grounds and something baking, butter and brown sugar, the kind of smell that belonged to someone's grandmother's kitchen and nowhere else. 4 tables, 6 stools along a short counter, a chalkboard on the wall listing today's offerings in handwriting that tilted slightly uphill. Nobody was sitting down. It was early enough that the breakfast rush, if this place had one, hadn't arrived. Ronan stepped inside. Decker pulled the door shut and stood against it. Priest moved to the window and angled himself so he could see the street without being seen from it. Behind the counter, a woman had her back turned. She was reaching up to a shelf, moving a jar of something, and she hadn't heard them come in over the sound of the espresso machine cycling through its warm-up sequence. Dark hair pulled back, a gray apron over a green sweater. Slim, but not delicate. There was something in the set of her shoulders that suggested a person who'd carried weight for a long time and had stopped thinking of it as unusual. Ronan was about to speak when she turned around. The jar she'd been holding hit the counter, didn't break, just landed hard and sat there. Elena Mercer looked at him the way a person looks at something that cannot be real, the way the mind does that half-second stutter where it offers you an escape hatch. Trick of the light, wrong face, you're wrong, before slamming shut and confirming what you already know. She knew him. Of course she did. 7 years didn't change a face like Ronan Viscari's. It just sharpened the damage already in it. He knew her too. He'd spent the first 2 years after she disappeared believing she was dead. He'd spent the next 3 believing she'd left because she found out what he was. And he'd spent the last 2 trying to stop thinking about her altogether, which was the only project of his adult life that had comprehensively failed. Elena, her name in his mouth, and the room contracted. She didn't say anything. Her hands were flat on the counter, very still, and she was doing something with her breathing, controlling it, rationing it, the way you do when you need your body to behave and you can't quite trust it. "Don't," she said, "just that." "Don't what?" "Don't say my name like that." "Like what?" "Like you have a right to." Ronan took 1 step toward the counter and stopped. Something in her posture told him the distance mattered. He read bodies for a living. It was how he'd survived this long. And what her body was telling him was, stay back, underlined twice. He stayed back. I'm not here for... He stopped, looked at his hands. There was blood on the left one, not his. He hadn't noticed until now. We were ambushed. We needed a door. This was the closest. He glanced at the window where Priest was still watching the street. You need to stay away from the windows. I need you to leave. We can't leave right now. I don't care. Elena. His voice dropped the way it did when negotiation was over. I'm not asking. She closed her eyes. 1 second. 2. When she opened them, they were dry and hard and resolved, and he recognized that too. The look of someone who'd already run every calculation and didn't like any of the answers. Fine, she said. Back room. Don't touch anything. She was already moving out from behind the counter, heading toward the door at the back of the cafe, and Ronan was following when he heard a sound that stopped him completely. Small feet on linoleum. Fast. The kitchen door swung open, and a boy came out at a near run, already talking before he'd fully cleared the doorway. Mom, the muffins are ready. The timer went off, but I didn't pull them because last time you said I had to ask first, and he stopped. The boy looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at the boy, and the bottom dropped out of the world. He was 7, maybe just turned 7, still with that slightly too large for him quality of a kid who'd grown fast and hadn't quite caught up to his own limbs yet. Dark hair, same shade as Ronan's. Jaw already showing the architecture that would be unmistakable in another decade. And his eyes, gray, pale, storm-colored, the exact eyes Ronan saw in the mirror every morning of his life. The boy's gaze moved from Ronan to the 2 men by the door and windows. And instead of retreating, instead of running back to the kitchen the way any child with functional survival instinct would have done, he moved forward. He positioned himself between the strangers and his mother, squared up his small shoulders, and looked at Ronan with an expression that was so specifically, painfully familiar that it hit Ronan somewhere behind the sternum and didn't let go. It was the face Ronan made when he was preparing to be hit. "Who are you?" the boy asked. Ronan couldn't answer. He looked at Elena. Elena had gone the color of old paper. She was looking at her son with an expression that was love and terror in the same breath, and when she finally looked back at Ronan, there was something else there too, something that had been held in place for years by sheer force of will and was now coming loose. "Noah," she said carefully, "go back in the kitchen, baby." "But Mom." "Go! I'll get the muffins. Go!" The boy, Noah, looked at Ronan one more time. There was no fear in it, just assessment, just that same cold inventory that Ronan had been doing to hostile rooms since he was 14 years old. Then he turned and went back through the kitchen door, and the door swung shut behind him. Ronan waited until the sound of his footsteps had faded. "Elena," he said. His voice was barely recognizable to himself. "Tell me." She didn't look away. She owed him that much, apparently, or maybe she was just too tired to look away. When she spoke, her voice was flat and deliberate, each word placed down like something fragile. "He's your son, Ronan." The rain kept hitting the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pan shifted on a rack. Decker and Priest were both very carefully not looking at either of them. Ronan stood in the middle of that small, warm cafe, with blood on his hand and a hole opening up in his chest that had nothing to do with the ambush, and for the first time in a very long time, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. He said, "How old?" 7. He turned 7 in April. 7 years. She'd left. She had disappeared, off the face of the earth. No body, no note, no phone call. 7 years ago, which meant she'd left carrying his child and hadn't told him. 7 years of a life happening inside a tiny cafe on a forgotten block in a city he'd had no reason to visit. And he'd been 3 miles away from her, from both of them, without knowing. Why? Not why did you leave? Not why didn't you tell me? Just why? Because that single syllable contained all of it, and he didn't have the architecture right now to build a longer sentence. Elena reached under the counter. He tensed. Old reflex. But she came up with a dish towel, which she set on the counter between them like some kind of offering. "Sit down," she said. "You're bleeding." I'm not bleeding. Your man is. She nodded toward Priest, who was indeed bleeding through his jacket sleeve in a way he'd been pretending wasn't happening. Sit down or don't. But I'm not answering that question while you're standing in my door ready to run. Ronan looked at Priest. Priest shrugged, which reopened something, and he winced. Sit, Ronan told him. They sat. Elena went for a first aid kit under the counter. Stocked better than most, he noticed, which was a thing he filed away. And she started working on Priest's arm with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before and hadn't enjoyed it. Ronan pulled out a stool and sat across the counter from her and waited. 7 years ago, she started and then stopped. Reorganized. Started again. 3 weeks before I left, I found something I wasn't supposed to find. Documents. Transfers. I was at the office. I know, I wasn't supposed to be there, but you'd left your laptop, and I was dropping it off, and the drive was already open. Ronan remembered the office she was talking about. The secondary one, off Fifth, that he used for operations he didn't run through the main house. What kind of documents? Contracts. For a cleanup. She kept her eyes on Priest's arm, kept her hands moving. 2 names on it. Mine. And the child's. She paused. Except I hadn't told you yet. I'd only just found out myself. 2 days. The air in the room changed. Someone in your organization, she continued, already knew I was pregnant. Before you did. And they'd already paid someone to make sure neither of us made it to spring. Ronan's hands were very still on the counter. I couldn't come to you, she said. The contract was brokered through your network. It had your operations signature on every layer. I didn't know if you'd ordered it. I didn't know if you knew. I didn't know if telling you would make it worse or... She stopped. When she continued, the flatness in her voice cracked, just slightly, at the edges. I had 48 hours, I think. Maybe less. I took what I could carry, and I left. You thought I ordered it. I thought you might have. The words sat between them. Elena, I was 26 years old, I was 8 weeks pregnant, and I had a contract on my life from an organization I couldn't fight. She looked at him now, directly, and her eyes were not soft. They had not been soft in a long time. What was I supposed to do? Stand still and find out which answer was true? Ronan said nothing, because she was right, and he knew she was right, and the part of him that wanted to be angry about the 7 years was having a very hard time overcoming the part of him that understood exactly why she'd run. He would have run too. He would have advised her to run. He pressed his palms flat on the counter and looked at the chalkboard on the wall with its tilted handwriting and its list of soups and sandwiches and tried to make himself breathe slowly. The contract, he said. Did you keep anything? Copies, digital, on a drive that's not in this building. Who else knew you were here? No one. It took me 2 years to feel safe enough to stop moving. I've been here 4. Ronan turned to look at the kitchen door. It was still closed. He could hear faintly the sound of a 7-year-old boy doing something with dishes, the soft clink of a pan, the squeak of a sneaker on tile. What does he know? He asked. Elena wrapped a bandage around Priest's arm with 2 precise movements and stepped back. He knows his father wasn't able to be with us. He knows it was complicated. She looked at Ronan the way someone looks at a problem they've been solving for years and are not done solving. He doesn't know anything about what you are. What I was, Ronan said. Is that a distinction that matters? He didn't answer that. Instead, he got off the stool and walked to the window, angling himself the way Priest had, checking the street. The rain was heavier now. No vehicles he didn't recognize. No one parked wrong. The neighborhood was quiet enough that anything unusual would announce itself, but the ambush that morning had been too clean, too coordinated. 3 separate choke points activated within 90 seconds of each other, which meant a team of at least 12, which meant resources and planning and someone who had access to his internal calendar. He'd walked out of it with 2 men and some blood that wasn't his. That wasn't luck. That was someone deciding to let him walk out. Why? He came back to the counter. You said the contract had your name and the child's, he said. Who signed it? On our side, who authorized it? Elena looked at him for a long moment. That's what I've been trying to figure out for 7 years, she said. The name at the bottom was one I recognized, but only barely. A mid-level man. Someone who was definitely executing, not deciding. She paused. He died about a year after I left. Car accident. Clean. Cleaned, Ronan said. That's what I assumed. He thought about that. Thought about who in his organization 7 years ago had the reach and the foresight to plant a cleanup contract on a woman who was newly pregnant, to know about that pregnancy before even he did, and to then execute the contractor neatly enough to close the thread. There were maybe 3 men with that capability. He trusted all 3 of them, which meant one of his most fundamental operating assumptions was wrong. Before he could push further down that road, Decker straightened from his position by the door. Car, he said. Black, moving slow. Ronan was across the room in 3 steps. He looked through the edge of the door's glass panel without putting his face in the light. A black SUV, no plates visible from this angle, rolling at the pace of something searching rather than something passing through. It stopped at the intersection. Back, Ronan said. Elena was already moving. Whatever she thought of him, whatever 7 years had built between them in the form of walls and locked rooms and carefully maintained silences, the reflex was still there. She heard his voice in that register, and she moved. She went to the kitchen door and pushed through it without being told, and he heard her voice, low and quick, telling Noah to come with her. Don't ask questions, come on. Ronan pulled Decker back from the door. Side exit? Through the kitchen, Decker said. I clocked an alley door when we came in. We go through the kitchen. He looked at the door Elena had just gone through. On the other side of it was a 7-year-old boy with gray eyes and his jaw and a name Ronan hadn't known until 4 minutes ago. We take them with us. Priest, arm freshly bandaged, checked his weapon. They'll slow us down. I know. Viscari. I know, Ronan said again, harder. We take them with us. He pushed through the kitchen door. Noah was standing next to his mother with his jacket half on, watching Ronan enter with that same unblinking inventory-taking stare, and Ronan stopped for just a second, just one beat, looking at his son, and feeling something crack open in him that he didn't have a name for and couldn't afford right now. Can you run? He asked the boy. Noah looked at his mother. Elena gave him a small, tight nod. Yeah, Noah said. Good. Ronan moved past them toward the alley door. Stay close to your mom. Don't stop for anything. He hit the alley door and the cold air hit him like a wall, rain immediately soaking through the back of his collar, and they were moving. Decker first, then Elena pulling Noah by the hand, then Priest, then Ronan covering the rear, through the narrow alley that smelled like wet garbage and old brick, away from the black SUV and the street and the quiet little cafe with its chalkboard menu and its yellow light and its smell of butter and brown sugar that Ronan was already certain, with a certainty that sat in his gut like cold lead, was not going to stay intact much longer. He didn't know yet who was in that car. He didn't know yet how they'd been found. What he knew, with the kind of bone-deep knowledge that didn't require evidence, was that this was not the end of something. This was the beginning. And somewhere in the logic of who had ordered that contract 7 years ago, of who had the resources to run a 12-man ambush and then deliberately let him survive it, a shape was forming. Something he couldn't see clearly yet but could feel the edges of, the way you feel a blade before it finds your skin. At the mouth of the alley, he glanced back. Noah had matched his mother's pace exactly, head down, rain plastering dark hair to his forehead, moving with a focused efficiency that was deeply, painfully familiar. The boy ran the way Ronan did. He ran like someone who'd learned early that stopping meant getting caught. They cleared the alley and turned north, folding into the gray morning, and Ronan kept moving and kept not thinking about what it meant that his son had learned to run before he'd ever known there was a reason to. And behind them, back on the quiet street, the door of the black SUV swung open, and 2 men stepped out and looked at the cafe entrance, and then at the alley, and reached for their phones. Ronan didn't see this, but the man they called to deliver the message did, and that man picked up the phone and said 3 words to the voice on the other end. 3 words that sent everything spinning toward collision. He found them. They ran north for 4 blocks before Ronan pulled them off the street. The building he chose was a parking structure on Henley Avenue. 6 stories of bare concrete, half empty at this hour, smelling of motor oil and the particular cold that concrete holds even in summer. He'd used it twice before for situations that required a pause without a destination. It had 3 exits, no cameras on the upper levels, and lines of sight in every direction from the roof. They took the stairs. Elena didn't ask why. She kept Noah's hand in hers and she climbed, and she didn't look back at Ronan, which was a thing he noticed and put away. They stopped on the 4th level. Decker moved to the ramp opening and crouched, watching the entrance below. Priest sat down on the concrete with his back against a pillar and breathed carefully, conserving whatever he had left. The bandage on his arm was holding, but his color wasn't good. Noah stood next to his mother and looked around the parking structure with the methodical curiosity of a child cataloging an unfamiliar environment. He counted the pillars, he looked at the ramp, he looked at the exits, then he looked at Ronan. "Are those men going to come here?" he asked. "Not right away," Ronan said. "But maybe." "Maybe." Noah considered this. "Okay." He sat down on the concrete next to Priest, which surprised everyone, including Priest, and pulled his jacket tighter around himself and said nothing else. Elena watched her son sit down next to a bleeding stranger with the composure of a boy who'd been preparing for something like this his whole life without knowing it, and something moved across her face that she shut down fast. Ronan moved to stand beside her, not close, just close enough to talk without being heard by the others. "The drive," he said. "The one with the copies. Where?" "Safe deposit, branch on Meridian, under a name you don't know." "I need it." "I know you do." She wasn't looking at him. She was watching Noah. "That doesn't mean I'm handing it to you." "Elena, you don't get to walk back into my life by 4 hours and start making demands." Her voice was quiet, completely controlled, and more dangerous than if she'd shouted. "That's not how this works. Someone just sent a 12-man team to kill me this morning. They followed us to your cafe inside of an hour. That means they already knew where you were, which means your cover is gone, which means that drive is the only leverage you have." "I'm aware." "Are you aware that Noah is also on this?" She turned to look at him then. Her jaw was tight. "He was on it before he was born," she said. "I've been aware of that for 7 years." Ronan held her gaze. Up close, in the flat gray light of the parking structure, she looked like someone who'd been fighting a war in private for a very long time. Not beaten, nothing like beaten, but worn in the specific way of a person who'd chosen vigilance over rest so many times it had become the default setting. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there before. Her hands, when she crossed her arms, showed the kind of roughness that came from actual work, daily and repeated. She'd built something, on her own, from nothing. He didn't say any of that. He said, "We need to move to somewhere defensible before tonight. I have a property in Ravenna, off books, not connected to anything current." "Ravenna," she repeated, 12 minutes from here. "And we just go there, the 3 of us and your 2 men, to a house that belongs to a man whose enemies just tried to kill him this morning." She tilted her head slightly. "You see the problem? The problem is that someone already knows this city well enough to vector an ambush at my location and track us to your street inside 60 minutes. The problem is that you and Noah cannot go back to that cafe. The problem," he said, keeping his voice level by an act of will, "is that we are already inside the situation, and debating the entrance is not useful." Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her son, who had apparently introduced himself to Priest and was now engaged in some low-voiced conversation about something that made Priest smile despite himself. "One condition," she said. "Tell me. Noah doesn't get told anything he doesn't ask about. Not yet. Not until I decide the time is right." She met his eyes. "He's 7 years old. He doesn't need to know what any of this means." Ronan thought about the way the boy had positioned himself between his mother and 3 strangers without hesitating. He thought about the way he'd looked at the exits. "He already knows more than you think he does," Ronan said. "Maybe. But knowing something and being told it are different." Her voice held a warning that was old and very serious. "Promise me." "I promise you." She nodded once, The way people nod when they've accepted a term they don't fully trust but have run out of alternatives. Then she walked over to Noah and crouched down to his level and said something quiet to him, and Noah nodded and stood up. Decker brought the car around, a gray sedan that one of his contacts kept garaged 2 blocks away for exactly these situations. And they loaded in and drove to Ravenna in silence, the rain coming down steadily, the city moving around them in complete indifference. The property was a house, not an estate. 2 stories, modest exterior, the kind of place that belonged to a professor or a contractor. Nothing about it announced itself. Inside it was different. Reinforced doors, blacked-out upper windows, a generator in the basement, and a security system that Ronan had installed himself and updated every 6 months. He brought them through the side entrance, checked every room before he let anyone settle, and then stood in the kitchen and called the only 2 people he trusted enough to call. The first call went to a man named Carver, who handled logistics and kept his mouth shut. Ronan told him to secure the cafe on Clement Street, remove anything personal, and watch the block without being seen. The second call went to Silas Kane. Silas picked up on the second ring, which he always did. His voice was measured and warm, the voice of a man who was always slightly ahead of the conversation, always already there when you arrived. "I heard there was trouble this morning," Silas said. 12 men at the waterfront. They knew my route." "Christ." A pause. The right length of pause. "You're clear?" "For now. I'm off grid." Ronan kept his voice neutral. "I need you to run something. 7 years ago. Cleanup contract, 2 names on it, authorized through a mid-level man named Creed. He died about a year after. Car accident." Silence on the other end. Then, "That's specific. What's the context?" "Old business. It came back up. I need the chain of authorization. Who above Creed signed off? Who knew about it? Where the money moved?" "That's deep archive," Silas said. "Going to take some time." "I know. Get me what you can." He paused. "Don't tell anyone you're looking." Another pause, shorter this time. "Of course not. You all right, Ronan?" "Fine," Ronan said. "I'll be in touch." He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment with the phone in his hand and the feeling of something not quite right moving around the edges of the conversation, too subtle to name, too persistent to dismiss. He put it away and went to find Elena. She'd put Noah in one of the upstairs rooms, smaller, no windows, which she'd chosen herself without being told. And she'd sat with him until the tension in his small body wound down and he'd fallen asleep sideways on the bed with his jacket still on. She'd pulled a blanket over him and come back downstairs and was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Ronan sat across from her. "Talk to me about the contract," he said. "Everything you remember." Elena wrapped both hands around the mug. "I've been through this in my head so many times the details feel worn smooth." "Tell me anyway." She did. She was precise, which didn't surprise him. She'd always been precise. It was one of the first things he'd noticed about her. The documents had been on a secondary drive attached to his laptop, in a folder labeled with an operations code he recognized but hadn't opened in years. She'd seen her name rendered in the clinical shorthand of an internal contract, Asset M.E., neutralized prior to delivery. And the secondary notation that had made her blood stop, associated gestation, collateral. Someone had written those words about his unborn child and called it collateral. "The authorization code at the top," he said. "Do you remember it?" "I wrote it down. It's on the drive." "The format. Do you remember the format?" She closed her eyes briefly. 7 digits. Started with a 4, then a dash, then 4 more. She opened her eyes. "I've never been able to match it to a person. The coding system you used. I didn't know how it worked." Ronan knew. He'd built that system with 2 people, himself and Silas Kane. He didn't say this. He sat with it, the weight of it, and kept his face where it needed to be. "I'm going to need that drive," he said again. "Tomorrow," she said. "Bank opens at 9. I'll go with you. I'll send someone with you. I'll go with you," she repeated, with a precision that made it clear this was not a negotiation. "Or I go alone. Those are the options." He almost argued. He stopped himself. She'd kept that drive safe for 7 years without his help. She'd earned the right to terms. Fine, he said. Tomorrow at 9. She nodded, looked at the coffee, drank some, finally, without any apparent enjoyment. You said you were going to leave, she said. The life. You told me that once. I remember. How much of that was real? The question landed flat on the table between them, not accusatory, genuinely asking. About 60%, he said. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. At least you're not going to tell me all of it. It doesn't seem like the time for flattering lies. When would it be the time? Elena, I'm not... She stopped, set the mug down. I'm not starting a fight. I'm too tired for that. I'm just trying to figure out what I'm dealing with. She looked at him directly. Are you still inside it? Completely? Less than I was, he said. The waterfront meeting this morning was about divestment, moving assets out of certain operations. Whose operations? People I've been tied to for a long time. People who would have a reason not to want that transition to happen. He paused. People with the resources to run a 12-man ambush. She studied him. You think this morning and the contract 7 years ago are connected? I think they might be the same operation on a longer timeline, he said. He watched her process that. He watched her do the math. The same math he'd been doing since she'd first told him, laid out across the kitchen table of a safe house in the rain, what she'd found 7 years ago. And he watched the moment she got to the same answer he had. Her face didn't change much. She was good at that. But something in her eyes shifted. If they're the same, she said carefully, then whoever ordered the contract 7 years ago is still active, still inside your circle. Yes. And they knew about Noah then, which means they might still... Yes. She stood up. The chair scraped back and she was on her feet, and the calm she'd been maintaining cracked down the middle for exactly 2 seconds. Her hands pressed flat on the table, her head down, her breath coming hard. 2 seconds. Then she pulled it back together, straightened up, and looked at him. How sure are you? She said. Her voice was steady again. The way a foundation is steady after an earthquake, functional, but something had shifted underneath. Not completely, but enough. What does enough mean to you? It means I'm treating it as confirmed until I find out I'm wrong. She nodded, processed, nodded again. Then we get the drive tomorrow and we figure out whose code is on that authorization. Yes. And if the name we find is someone you trust. Ronan said nothing. Ronan, if it's someone inside your circle, then I handle it, he said. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have right now. She stared at him long enough that he felt it, and then she picked up her coffee and walked toward the stairs. I'm going to sit with Noah, she said. Wake me if anything changes. She went upstairs. Ronan sat at the table alone in the kitchen and listened to the rain hitting the windows and thought about the authorization code and thought about who had built that coding system with him and thought about all the things that would have to be true for the shape he was feeling around the edges to be what he suspected it was. He didn't sleep. At 2 a.m, Decker came and found him. You need to see this, Decker said. He led Ronan to the room they'd set up as a temporary ops center. A spare bedroom with a folding table and a laptop and a scanner. On the screen was a set of documents Carver had pulled from the cafe before sealing it. Someone had gotten there first. Not Carver's team. Carver's team had arrived to find the cafe had already been entered. Back door, professional, no prints. They'd gone through the counter, the storage room, the kitchen, clean and fast. What were they looking for? Ronan asked. Carver says nothing obvious was taken. Cash was still there, equipment untouched. Then they were looking for something specific. He thought about what Elena had said. The drive wasn't in the building, but whoever had searched the cafe didn't know that, which meant whoever had ordered the search had incomplete intelligence, which meant their information had a gap in it. That was something. Not much, but something. He went back to the kitchen and sat down and turned his phone over in his hands and thought about the call he'd made to Silas. Thought about the length of the pause when he'd mentioned Creed's name. The right length of pause. That was the phrase his mind kept returning to. The right length. As if it had been practiced. As if the pause itself was a performance. Silas Kane had been with him for 19 years. He'd come up through the organization under Ronan's father, Marcus Viscari, and when Marcus died, heart failure, sudden, in his office on a Tuesday morning 9 years ago, Silas had been the one who held the organization together while Ronan stepped into the role he'd never entirely wanted. Silas had run the funeral arrangements. He'd managed the internal transitions. He'd been the one who sat across the table from the other families and said, with complete conviction, that the Viscari operation was stable and its alliances would hold. Ronan had trusted him the way you trust a building you've lived in for 20 years. Not because you check the foundation every day, because it's always been there. But there were things about Marcus's death he'd never fully examined. Things he'd been too raw to look at clearly and then too busy to return to. Like the fact that Marcus, at 61, with the cardiovascular profile of a man 10 years younger, had died at his desk on a Tuesday morning with no warning and no witnesses. Like the fact that Silas had been the one to find him. Like the fact that the audit Marcus had been quietly running on the organization's offshore accounts, an audit that Silas had advised against, that Silas had called unnecessary and divisive, had stopped completely with Marcus's death and had never been resumed. Ronan pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He thought, I might be building a case out of proximity and grief and paranoia. He thought, or I might have been standing next to the thing this entire time and calling it family. At 5 in the morning, Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was still in yesterday's clothes, hair sideways from sleep, and he looked at Ronan with the specific guardedness of a child who'd woken up in an unfamiliar place and was deciding how alarmed to be. You didn't sleep, Noah said. No. Mom says you should always sleep because your brain doesn't work right otherwise. Your mom is correct. Noah came into the kitchen. He looked at the coffee pot. He looked at Ronan. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, which was exactly what Elena had done, and the parallel landed somewhere between Ronan's ribs. You're not going to ask me anything? Ronan said. I have questions, Noah said. I'm deciding which ones. Take your time. Noah looked at him with that unblinking gray assessment. Mom's scared, he said. She doesn't show it, but I can tell. She holds her breath when she's scared. I know, Ronan said. And then, because it was true, she's one of the strongest people I've ever met. I know that, Noah said, with the mild impatience of someone being told something self-evident. I've known that my whole life. He paused. Are you going to make it worse? Being here? Is it better or worse that you showed up? Ronan looked at his son, this 7-year-old who was asking him, with complete seriousness, to assess his own impact, and felt something he didn't have a clean word for. I don't know yet, he said, but I'm going to try to make it better. Noah looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded slowly, the way Elena nodded when she'd accepted a term she didn't fully trust. It occurred to Ronan that the boy had learned that gesture from somewhere. It occurred to him that he did that same thing. He was still sitting with that when his phone buzzed on the table. A text from a number he didn't recognize. Burner, untraceable, 3 words and an image. He looked at the image first. It was a photograph of the parking structure on Henley Avenue, time-stamped 4:47 a.m., taken from the street level, looking up at the 4th floor, the exact level where they'd stopped, which meant someone had followed them there last night, had been watching them in the parking structure and hadn't moved, hadn't called in a team, hadn't done anything, just taken a photograph. He looked at the 3 words. We need to talk. And then a second message arrived, 30 seconds later, from the same number. This one was longer. The ambush this morning wasn't meant for you. Check who authorized the team. Check the target name on the original order. You've been running the wrong direction for 17 hours, Ronan. The boy isn't a footnote in someone else's war. He read it twice. The boy isn't a footnote. Noah, who had been quietly watching Ronan's face, said, What is it? Ronan turned the phone face down on the table. Nothing, he said. Go back to sleep. But Noah didn't move. He stayed in his chair and looked at Ronan with those gray eyes that saw too much, and Ronan looked back at him, and between them the silence held the shape of everything that had just changed. Because if the text was right, if the ambush at the waterfront had not been aimed at Ronan at all, then someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it look like an assassination attempt on a Mafia kingpin, when the real target was a 7-year-old boy in a tiny cafe who didn't even know his own last name. And whoever was texting him knew that, knew the address of the parking structure, knew the timestamp, Knew things that should have been impossible to know, which meant either Ronan had a guardian angel he'd never asked for, or he had a second enemy who was considerably more patient than the first. He picked up the phone again, typed one word back. Who? The reply came in 11 seconds. Someone who's been watching Silas Kane for 3 years. Meet me. Come alone. I'll know if you don't. And then, before Ronan could respond, one final message. 4 words that landed like the floor dropping out from under everything he thought he knew about the last decade of his life. Your father didn't die naturally. Ronan sat with the phone in his hand for a long time after that last message arrived. Your father didn't die naturally. Noah was watching him from across the table. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind that particular pre-dawn silence that felt less like peace and more like the world holding its breath. Go upstairs, Ronan said. You said that already. I mean it this time. Noah studied him for another moment. That same inventory-taking stare, patient and unnerving. And then he got up without argument and padded back toward the stairs. Ronan listened to his footsteps climb and stop, and then the soft sound of a door closing. He looked at the phone. He typed, "Where?" The reply came back in under a minute. An address in Sodo, the industrial stretch south of downtown, a warehouse district that had been half converted to artist studios and half left to rust. A unit number, a time, 6:30 a.m., 40 minutes from now. Then, leave your men. I'll know. Ronan got up. He took his jacket off the back of the chair and put it on and stood in the kitchen long enough to run the math on how badly this could go. A meeting at an industrial address, pre-dawn, with an anonymous contact who'd photographed him without being seen and claimed to know things about Silas Kane that should have been impossible to know. The last time he'd walked into a room without knowing who was in it, 12 men had tried to kill him. He went anyway. He left Decker with the house and told him to call immediately if anything moved outside. He didn't tell Decker where he was going, which meant he also didn't tell Silas, because Decker reported up through Silas the same way everyone in the organization did. That was the architecture Silas himself had built, years ago, in the name of operational efficiency. Ronan thought about that architecture now, driving through empty streets in the gray pre-dawn, and thought about how efficiently it would move information upward to a single point. The warehouse was on Occidental, a low brick building with a corrugated steel door and no signage. The unit number corresponded to a side entrance, a regular door, unlocked when he tried it. Inside was dark except for a single work light in the far corner, the kind that runs on a battery pack and throws a hard white circle on whatever's in front of it. A woman was sitting in that circle of light. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now something better. Specific, intelligent, marked by decisions. Her hair was silver and cut short. She was wearing a gray coat, and she had a manila folder on her knees, and her hands were folded on top of it, and she looked at Ronan when he came in with the expression of someone who'd been waiting longer than just tonight. "Ronan Viscari," she said. Not a greeting, just confirmation. "You have me at a disadvantage," he said. "I've had you at a disadvantage for about 3 years." She tilted her head slightly. "My name is Vera Strand. For the last 6 years, I've been building a case against Silas Kane and every corrupted institution he's embedded himself in. I'm not law enforcement. I was for a long time. I'm not anymore." "What are you now?" "Someone who wants the same thing you want." She looked at him steadily. "To watch him burn." Ronan crossed the space between them slowly and pulled a folding chair from against the wall and sat down. 6 feet between them, close enough to talk, far enough to move if he needed to. "My father," he said. Vera opened the folder on her knees. She removed a photograph and held it out to him. He took it. It was a lab report. The header was from a toxicology service in Portland, dated 8 years and 4 months ago, 7 months after his father's death. The name on the report was Marcus Adren Vescari. The document was dense with clinical language, but the relevant section was highlighted in yellow, and someone had written in the margin in red ink, neat block letters, potassium chloride, injected, not naturally occurring elevation. Ronan's hands were very still. The original coroner's report said cardiac event, Vera said, which is technically accurate. Potassium chloride at that concentration stops the heart. It metabolizes quickly, unless you know to test for the specific compound ratio within a narrow post-mortem window. The original examiner didn't test for it. I found someone who went back to the tissue samples. How did you get tissue samples? I've been doing this for a long time. She paused. The samples were archived as part of the standard estate medical file. It took me 18 months to get legal access, and another 4 to get the testing done through a private lab. Ronan looked at the photograph for a long time. His father's name in the header, clinical language around it like a frame. He put the photograph down on his knee and looked at Vera Strand. Silas, he said. One word. Silas was in the building that morning. He was in the building most mornings. You know that. The security log shows him entering Marcus's office at 7:42 a.m. Marcus was found at 8:15 by his assistant. She removed another document from the folder. There's a gap in the building's camera system, the hallway outside Marcus's office, that runs from 7:39 to 8:21. 42 minutes. The gap was logged as a system error. Silas controlled the security contracts. He had for 4 years at that point. She held out the second document. After Marcus died, the offshore audit Marcus had been running stopped. The accounts that audit would have flagged moved roughly $60 million over the following 14 months. The movement was structured to look like standard operational redistribution. I've been tracing where it landed. Ronan took the second document. He looked at it. The account numbers meant nothing to him in isolation, but the routing structure, the specific layering pattern, was familiar in the way that something you designed yourself is always familiar, even when you encounter it unexpectedly, because he hadn't designed this. Silas had, using Ronan's own authorization codes as cover, his own codes, which meant that anyone investigating those movements would find Ronan's signature on them, not Silas's. The blood in his face moved somewhere else. He used my credentials, Ronan said, selectively. For the movements he needed to stay clean himself, yes. Vera's voice was measured, but there was something underneath it. Not satisfaction, something older and harder. If federal investigators had been called in at any point in the last 8 years, the first name they would have landed on is yours. Ronan set both documents down on his knee. He pressed the heel of his hand against his mouth and sat with this, with what it meant, with the geometry of it, the 19 years of geometry it retroactively rewrote. Silas at his father's funeral, standing beside him. Silas in the meeting rooms, across the table from the other families, steady and competent and trustworthy. Silas telling him 3 years ago that the divestment plan was too risky, too fast, that Ronan needed to move more carefully. Silas reviewing the security protocols every quarter. Silas who had built the system through which every piece of operational information moved upward. To Silas. The contract 7 years ago, Ronan said, on Elena Mercer and the child. I found it 14 months after it was issued. Vera turned to a section deeper in the folder. I was already watching certain account movements by then. The payment for that contract ran through a shell that I'd flagged for other reasons. She paused. I didn't know who Elena Mercer was at that point. I knew the contract existed and I knew the money trail. By the time I had a full picture, she was already gone and the executing contractor was dead. Did you know she was alive? I found her about 2.5 years ago. I've been watching from a distance. Something shifted in Vera's expression. Not quite apology, but adjacent to it. I made a decision not to approach her. If I'd approached her, Silas would have eventually noticed. She was safer as an unknown. The anger that moved through Ronan at that was fast and hot, and he let it go because she wasn't wrong, and being right about a terrible decision didn't make it less terrible. The boy, he said. You knew about Noah. Yes. And you said the ambush yesterday wasn't aimed at me. His voice had gone very flat. Explain that. Vera took a breath. This apparently was the part she'd been working up to. 3 months ago, Marcus Viscari's estate lawyers received a filing they weren't expecting, she said. A codicil to the original will, held in escrow by a third party for a period of 7 years, with instructions for release on a specific date. The date was Noah's 7th birthday. Ronan went completely still. Marcus knew about the pregnancy, Vera said. He'd known for some time. He had his own intelligence sources inside the organization that were separate from Silas's network. He didn't tell you because he was afraid that telling you would alert Silas. He was already suspicious of Silas by that point. The offshore audit he was running, she stopped, reorganized. Marcus spent the last 4 months of his life building a contingency. In the event of his death, in the event that Elena Mercer was forced to flee, in the event that a child survived, Marcus created a legal structure that would transfer certain assets directly to that child on their 7th birthday. The silence in the warehouse was absolute. What assets? Ronan said. The encrypted accounts, Vera said. The ones the offshore audit would have flagged. Marcus didn't just find the discrepancies. He went further. Over 2 decades, the Viscari operation had been used as a financial vehicle by a network of corrupted officials, judges, federal administrators, 3 sitting politicians at the time of his death, and the leadership of 4 other crime families. Marcus had been quietly accumulating documentation of all of it, not to use as leverage. He was past that by the end. He wanted out. He was building a case for voluntary cooperation with a federal task force. Ronan's mouth was dry. Silas found out, he said. Silas found out. Vera nodded. And Silas understood that the documentation, the encrypted archive Marcus had assembled, was the one thing that could bring down not just the Viscari organization, but every institution and individual that depended on its continued silence. She met his eyes. The archive is keyed to a biometric token. Marcus couldn't key it to himself. Too dangerous. He keyed it to a bloodline marker. Noah, Ronan said, the boy can unlock those files. Not with a password, with a physical token that Marcus had made, a keepsake he sent to Elena through a blind courier 2 weeks before he died, with a letter she didn't understand at the time. Vera paused. She kept it. She's kept it for 7 years because it was the last physical object she had that connected her to a time before she ran. The silver compass. He'd seen it on Elena's counter in the cafe, half hidden under a dish towel, and hadn't registered it. A small thing. Old-looking, the kind of object that accumulated significance through proximity to a person rather than any inherent value. His father had sent it to her. His father had been building a vault, and he'd hidden the key with the woman carrying his grandchild. And then Silas had killed him before the plan was finished, and Elena had run before she knew what she was carrying. And for 7 years that compass had been sitting in a drawer in a small cafe on a forgotten block while the archive it unlocked sat encrypted and untouched and full of enough evidence to bring down 36 powerful people who needed it to stay that way. The codicil, Ronan said. The estate lawyers. When the filing came through 3 months ago, it triggered a notification, Vera said. Standard legal process. The notification went to the estate trustee. She looked at him. Silas Kane has been the estate trustee since Marcus died. So Silas had known. For 3 months, Silas had known that the clock Marcus had set 7 years ago had activated, had known that the codicil existed, that Noah existed, that Elena was alive somewhere, had spent 3 months locating them, and yesterday morning had made his move. Not against Ronan, not primarily, but against the 7-year-old boy who could walk up to a compass and unlock the thing that would end all of it. The ambush at the waterfront had been a diversion. Get Ronan running, get Ronan isolated. And in the confusion, send a separate team to deal with the cafe. Ronan had run straight to Elena and Noah. He had led them directly to the team. The understanding of this moved through him like cold water filling a room. Slow at first and then suddenly everywhere, covering everything, no air left. The men who searched the cafe, he said. Looking for the compass, Vera confirmed. They didn't find it because Elena had it on her person when you left. He pulled out his phone, called Elena. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He was on his feet before the tone finished. He called Decker. Decker picked up on the first ring and said, without preamble, in a voice that was doing the same thing Elena's did when she was frightened, very controlled, rationing itself. We have a problem. What happened? 20 minutes ago. 2 vehicles came in from the south side. I don't know how they found the address. Decker's voice caught. Ronan, they got inside before I could... Is she alive? Elena's alive. She's here. She's... A sound in the background. Shuffling. A voice. She's asking for you. Noah. Silence. 3 seconds of silence that were the longest 3 seconds of Ronan's life. Noah's gone, Decker said. They took the boy. Ronan was already moving toward the door. Vera Strand stood and said his name, and he turned and looked at her with an expression that made her stop whatever she was about to say. The compass, he said. Is she carrying it? If she had it on her at the cafe, she still has it. They wouldn't have taken it off her without knowing what it was. Then they took Noah thinking the biometric key is the boy himself, that they need him physically to unlock the archive. That's what they believe, Vera said carefully. Are they right? A beat. Not entirely. The token Marcus created, the compass, is the primary key. Noah's biometric is the secondary verification. They need both. The compass alone does nothing without him, and he can't unlock anything without it. Which meant Noah was alive. They needed him alive and functional, and they would keep him that way long enough to find the compass, which meant Ronan had a window. He looked at Vera. You've been building this case for 3 years. What do you have that I can use tonight? I have documentation. I have account trails. I have the toxicology report on your father. None of it is useful tonight. That's not what I'm asking. He held her gaze. You know how Silas operates. You've watched him for 3 years. Where does he take a child he needs to keep alive and contained while he searches for something? Vera studied him. Then she reached into the folder and removed a single sheet. A printout, satellite image, a location marked with a red circle on the waterfront south of the ferry terminal. He owns a cargo company, she said. Legitimate on paper. 3 vessels currently in port. The largest one has been sitting at anchor for 6 weeks with no manifest filed. It should have moved. The Port Authority hasn't pressed because 2 members of the Oversight Board are in the archive. Ronan took the sheet. If he takes Noah aboard that vessel, Vera said, there is no jurisdiction, no response protocol that moves fast enough to, I know, Ronan said. Ronan, her voice dropped. If Silas gets the compass and uses Noah to unlock those files, he won't release the archive. He'll destroy it, and then he'll destroy every person who knows about it. I know that too. The people whose names are in that archive, politicians, judges, they've been waiting for 3 years for Silas to close this. They are not passive parties. They have resources. If this goes wrong tonight, I understand, Ronan said. He was already at the door. You can't do this with 2 men and a compromised safe house, Vera called after him. He stopped with his hand on the door, didn't turn around. I'm not going to do it with 2 men, he said. I'm going to do it with 1. He pushed through the door, and the cold air hit him, and he was moving, phone already up, calling Decker back, getting the address, running the route in his head. The waterfront. Silas's vessel. The cargo company that existed on paper and in the Port Authority's neglected files, and in 3 years of Vera Strand's painstaking documentation. And somewhere on that vessel, a 7-year-old boy who ran like someone who'd learned early that stopping meant getting caught. He drove back to the safe house in 8 minutes and went through the door and found Elena standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed and her face the color of the concrete walls, and Decker against the wall looking like a man who'd failed the one test that actually mattered. Elena looked at Ronan when he came in. She didn't say, "Where were you?" or "This is your fault," or any of the things that would have been true. She looked at him and said one word. Tell me. So he told her. All of it. Vera Strand, the toxicology report, his father's encrypted archive, the compass, what Noah's bloodline meant and why Silas had been hunting them both for 7 years. He put it on the table in front of her in plain language with no softening and no management, and he watched her receive it, piece by piece, and absorb it. She was quiet for a long time when he finished. Her hands were flat on the table. She was looking at the surface between them. The compass, she said. I have it. She reached into the front pocket of her jacket and set it on the table between them. Small, silver, old. The kind of thing you'd find in an antique shop and think was pretty without knowing what it was. Marcus Vescari had held this, had made this, had sent it through a blind courier to a young woman he'd never met who was carrying his grandchild, and had put everything he'd spent the last years of his life building into the bet that she would keep it safe. She had kept it safe for 7 years. I never knew what it was, Elena said. There was a letter with it. It said to keep it safe and give it to the child when the time was right. Her voice was very even. I thought it was a sentimental thing. I thought someone who cared about you had sent it through channels. She looked up. It came with a name, the sender's name. My father, Ronan said. I didn't know who Marcus Vescari was. Not then. She picked up the compass, turned it over in her hands, set it back down. I know now. Ronan looked at the compass, looked at her. I need you to stay here, he said, with Decker. I need that compass to stay. No, she said. Elena, you need the compass and you need Noah in the same place at the same time to unlock anything. She met his eyes, which means I'm going with you because I'm not leaving that compass out of my hands and I'm not waiting in a room while my son. Her voice broke, one syllable, and she stopped and breathed and came back. I'm not waiting. Ronan looked at her, at the set of her jaw, at the years of war in her face that he hadn't put there but had caused nonetheless. He wanted to argue. He had 3 arguments ready, all of them logistically sound. He said, Can you handle a weapon? She held his gaze for one beat. You'd be surprised what 7 years alone teaches you. He believed her. We leave in 10 minutes, he said. He turned to the window and looked out at the city starting to lighten at its edges, the sky going from black to a deep bruised gray, and thought about Silas Kane walking through his father's life for 19 years and his own life, like a man who'd bought the house and was patiently waiting for the current occupant to stop existing. Thought about Noah on that vessel, still and scared, probably, but not broken. He hadn't seen anything in that boy yet that broke easily. He picked up the compass from the table and closed his fingers around it. His father had made this bet 7 years before Ronan had any idea the game was being played, and the bet was sitting in his hand, and somewhere on the water Silas Kane was discovering that the boy he'd taken couldn't do anything without it, and that meant Silas was about to realize that the compass was with Elena, and that Elena was with Ronan, and that Ronan was coming. Silas had spent 19 years being several moves ahead. For the first time, Ronan thought he might know exactly where this was going before Silas did. He turned from the window and looked at Elena, who was checking a weapon with the efficiency of someone who meant what she'd said, and at Decker, who was already reading the expression on Ronan's face, and understanding that everything that came next was going to require him to be a different kind of man than he'd been hired to be. There's something you should both understand, Ronan said. What's on that vessel? What's in those encrypted files? It's enough to bring down people who have spent years making sure that nothing ever touches them. Judges. Officials. People with the kind of protection that makes them believe they're permanent. He paused. Once we unlock that archive, there's no version of tonight where things go back to what they were. The organization ends. My name is on things I'll have to answer for. Everything I've built. Gone. Decker said nothing. Elena looked at him steadily. I know, she said. Do you? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his jacket, pocketed the compass, and walked to the door. Let's go get our son, he said, and the word our came out of him before he decided to say it, raw and irreversible. And he didn't take it back, and Elena didn't flinch at it, and behind them Decker moved, and the door swung open onto the gray Seattle morning, and everything that had been building for 7 years, for 19 years, for the length of one man's patient and murderous ambition, began its final acceleration toward the waterfront, and the vessel sitting dark at anchor, and the boy inside it who didn't know yet what he was carrying or what it would cost to set it free. The waterfront smelled like diesel and rotting kelp, and the specific cold that comes off deep water before the sun has cleared the horizon. Ronan drove the last 4 blocks with the headlights off, navigating by the gray ambient light of a city not quite awake, and pulled into the shadow of a container depot 200 meters from the pier. He cut the engine. The three of them sat for a moment in the silence. Him, Elena, Decker. And the only sound was their breathing and the distant complaint of a foghorn somewhere out on the Sound. The vessel was visible from here. Callaway Meridian, container cargo, 300 feet of it, sitting low and dark at Pier 14 with no running lights and no activity on the visible deck, which meant either it was empty or it was very deliberately appearing to be empty, and Ronan had stopped believing in coincidences approximately 19 years ago. 2 men on the south gangway, Decker said, barely above a murmur. He had a compact scope to his eye. 1 moving on the upper deck, far side. Maybe more I can't see. Silas brought a team, Ronan said. He had time to position after they took Noah. How many? Silas doesn't do things small. 8 minimum. Probably 12 again. He looked at the pier. 1 gangway visible from this angle, running from the dock up to the main deck level. Cargo cranes on both sides, dark and still. A row of containers along the near dock that provided cover for maybe 2/3 of the approach. We go along the container line. Get to the base of the gangway, take the 2 on guard, get aboard fast before anyone on the upper deck reacts. That's the whole plan? Decker said. That's the first part. Elena was looking at the vessel with an expression that was past fear. Fear had a texture, a visible tremor to it. What was on her face now was something more compressed than fear. Grief that had been converted into fuel, which burned hotter and lasted longer and was considerably more dangerous. He'll be below deck, she said. They'd want him contained and out of sight from the dock. Cargo hold or crew quarters, Ronan agreed. Middle of the vessel, most likely. Structural cover from both ends. Then we go middle. She said it simply, like it was already decided. Ronan looked at her. She looked back at him, and her jaw was set, and her eyes were dry, and she had the compass in her jacket pocket, and her hand was resting near it, in the way you rest your hand near something you've been carrying long enough that it's become load-bearing. Stay behind me until we're aboard, he said. Once we're aboard, stay close. Don't engage unless you have to. Understood. Elena, I said understood. A pause, 1 beat of silence. Stop treating me like someone who needs managing and start treating me like the other person in this fight. He stopped. Looked at her for 1 more second. Then he nodded. They moved. The container line gave them good cover. Corrugated steel walls rising 20 feet on their right, the dark water on their left, the pier surface wet and sound-absorbing in a way that helped. Ronan went first, then Elena, then Decker, moving in the particular way you move when the distance between you and the next piece of cover is the most important measurement in the world. Low, fast, deliberate. No wasted motion. The 2 men at the base of the gangway were professionals, which meant they were watching the approach angles, not each other. Ronan had 30 feet of shadow on his right from the last container before the gangway. He used it. He closed the distance in the time it took one of the men to turn his head left, and he came in from behind the second one and took him down before the sound had finished happening. And Decker moved simultaneously on the first, and the whole thing was over in 6 seconds, and both men were on the dock and not getting up. They went up the gangway at a controlled run. The steel grating vibrated faintly underfoot. At the top, Ronan paused at the rail. The upper deck man that Decker had clocked was on the far side, and Ronan could see his silhouette through the gap between a pair of lashed containers, moving away from them. He filed the position and crossed the deck fast, moving toward the central superstructure, Elena's footsteps right behind him. The interior entrance was a heavy, watertight door with a lever handle. Ronan pulled it open and the smell hit them. Recycled air, metal, something chemical underneath. The passageway inside was narrow and lit by low strip lighting along the floor, the kind that stays on during power down mode. Pale blue light on painted steel. The sound of the vessel talking to itself. Pipes, settling steel, the faint heartbeat of the generator deep below. They went in. The passageway ran forward from the superstructure toward the bow and aft, toward the stern. Ronan went aft, toward the cargo sections. They passed closed doors, crew cabins, a mess room, a door labeled engineering that had a light under it. He moved past all of it, not stopping, keeping the pace, listening ahead of them for voices or movement. He heard it at the forward bulkhead of the cargo section. Voices, low. 2 of them, maybe 3. And underneath the voices, a sound that stopped his forward motion completely and brought Elena up hard against his shoulder because she'd heard it too. A child's voice. Not crying, talking, quiet and controlled. The way someone talks when they're trying to appear calm, which means they are frightened but they have decided not to show it. Noah's voice. Elena's hand found his arm and closed on it and released it. She was breathing very carefully. Ronan moved to the door and put his ear to it. He could hear Noah now. Short sentences, measured responses to something someone was saying to him. And the other voice, the adult voice, smooth and measured and familiar in the way that something you've heard for 19 years is familiar. Silas Kane, talking to a 7-year-old boy with the patient, reasonable tone he used for everything. Because Silas had understood very early that the most disarming thing in any negotiation was the appearance of reasonableness. Ronan stood with his hand on the door and his jaw tight and his breathing very slow. He had 3 seconds to decide how to do this. He went through the door. The cargo hold was half full, centine. Containers stacked along the walls, a cleared central space under the main lighting. Noah was sitting on a metal crate in the middle of that space. He wasn't bound. There was a man standing near him. Not touching him, just present, positioned between him and the exit in a way that communicated the same thing restraints would have without requiring them. Silas Kane stood 8 feet from Noah, in the open space, with his hands in the pockets of a dark coat and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the expression of a man in the middle of a perfectly ordinary conversation. He looked at Ronan when the door opened, and his expression didn't change, and that was the most accurate summary of who Silas Kane had always been. "Ronan," he said, like they were meeting in an office. Noah's head came up. His eyes found Ronan and then found Elena behind him, and something happened in his face. Not relief, not yet. Something more complicated. Like a person who'd been holding a position and finally saw the reinforcement arriving and had to decide whether to believe it was real. "You okay?" Ronan said to him. "Yeah," Noah said. "Just that. Don't move." "Okay." Ronan moved his eyes back to Silas. The guard near Noah hadn't moved, but his hand had repositioned, and there was a second man near the far containers and a third in the shadows to the left who Ronan clocked by the sound of his breathing. 3 in the room, however many outside and above. And Decker was behind Elena in the passageway, which meant Ronan had 2 people at his back and Silas had considerably more than that. Silas knew the math too. "I was wondering how long it would take you to find us," Silas said. "I estimated you'd have the location by 6:30. It's—" He glanced at his watch with the air of someone checking the time on a slow morning. 6:47. You were slower than I expected." "I stopped to hear some things," Ronan said. "About my father." A flicker. The first micro-expression Ronan had ever seen on Silas Kane's face in 19 years of watching it, and it was gone in less than a second, but it had been there. "I see," Silas said. "Vera Strand sends her regards." Silas was quiet for a moment. Something reorganized itself behind his eyes. Not panic. Silas didn't panic, but the particular quality of a man revising a calculation. "She's been a persistent problem," he said. "You should have solved her 3 years ago." "I know." A slight incline of his head. Hindsight. Ronan watched him. Watched the 3 men in the room and kept them in his peripheral vision, the way you keep peripheral vision on a room's whole geometry when the geometry is trying to kill you. "You killed my father," Ronan said. "Marcus was going to destroy everything," Silas said, calmly, the way you state a fact. Decades of work, relationships that took 20 years to build. He decided at 61 that he'd developed a conscience, that he wanted to cooperate with a federal task force and call it redemption. Something moved in Silas's face then, and it was the closest Ronan had ever seen to genuine feeling on it. "I built that organization alongside him for 16 years. I was not going to let one man's late-life crisis take it apart." "So you killed him?" "I made a decision." The distance between them was 8 feet. The man near Noah was 4 feet from the boy. The second man near the containers was 12 feet to Ronan's right. The third in the shadows was 9 feet to his left and slightly behind. The geometry was terrible. The contract on Elena and Noah, Ronan said. 7 years ago. You knew she was pregnant before I did. I had better intelligence than you did, Silas said. I've always had better intelligence than you. That was always the problem with your leadership, Ronan. You trusted people more than you should have. You were effective and you were feared, but you left gaps. He paused. Elena Mercer was a gap. A young woman who had access to your secondary office and who didn't have any particular loyalty to the organization's continued discretion. I identified the risk. She was carrying my child. She was a liability. The child compounded it. Silas said it without inflection, pure operational assessment. I'm not asking you to accept that. I'm explaining the logic. Ronan's hands were very still at his sides. He was aware of Elena behind him, could feel her presence, the tension coming off her in controlled waves, and he needed her to stay where she was, needed her to not move yet. The codicil, he said, Marcus's archive. You've had 3 months since the estate lawyers filed. 3 months to locate the boy and the compass, Silas confirmed. Your Elena was careful. It took time. He glanced toward Noah. The boy is unharmed, as you can see. I'm not interested in harming children. I never was. The original contract was a precaution, not a preference. Noah was watching this exchange with that unblinking inventory-taking gaze. He was, Ronan noticed, watching Silas's hands, not his face. His hands. Smart kid. Here's what's going to happen, Silas said, and his voice shifted into the tone Ronan had heard him use in 100 negotiating rooms. Final terms, non-negotiable, delivered with the courtesy of a man who considered the discussion already concluded. You're going to give me the compass. Noah is going to come with me, briefly, to verify the archive access. Once I've confirmed the archive can be accessed and I've secured the relevant files, he comes back to you. You take your family and you leave. The organization ends tonight. I'm not fighting for what's already over. The archive gets destroyed. The people whose names are in it pay me to destroy it, and then we all move on. And my father's death, Ronan said, goes with it. And Vera Strand. A pause. She becomes a problem I solve separately. Ronan looked at him, at the face he'd known for 19 years, at the man who'd stood beside him at his father's funeral and put a hand on his shoulder and said he'd be proud of you and had meant it as a piece of information about the quality of the deception he was running. No, Ronan said. Silas's expression didn't change. Ronan. No. He said it again, flat and final. Noah doesn't go anywhere with you. The compass doesn't go anywhere with you. And the archive doesn't get destroyed. He paused. My father spent the last 4 months of his life building something he believed was worth dying for. I'm not going to let you erase it. You understand what happens if you don't, Silas said. Still calm, still reasonable. The reasonableness had become something else now, something that had been waiting behind the civility the whole time. The people in that archive have been waiting 3 years for this to close. They are not patient men. If I don't deliver, then they come for you, Ronan said. Not me, you. Because you're the one who's been promising them closure. A beat. Something shifted. You've been thinking, Silas said. I've had a long night. Silas looked at him. Then he looked past him at Elena. Something in his assessment of her changed slightly. A recalibration, acknowledging a factor he'd underweighted. The compass, he said, one more time. No, Elena said from behind Ronan. Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he dropped his chin slightly, a small gesture, and the man near Noah moved. Everything happened fast. The man reached for Noah's arm, and Noah, 7 years old, gray-eyed, raised by a woman who'd turned vigilance into a lifestyle, twisted sideways off the crate and went low in the exact opposite direction from the man's grip, putting the crate between himself and the adult, and Ronan was already moving because he'd seen the chin drop and known what it meant. He covered the 8 feet to Silas in less than 2 seconds and hit him hard enough to drive them both into the container wall behind him, and Silas was older but not soft. He took the impact and came back with an elbow that caught Ronan across the jaw and rang his skull, and they were grappling, close and ugly, both of them trying to find the angle that ended it. Decker came through the door behind Elena and engaged the third man from the shadows. Ronan heard it more than saw it, the impact and the grunt and the scuffle of boots on steel. The second man near the containers was moving toward Elena. Elena moved first. She went toward him instead of back, which he hadn't expected, and the surprise bought her the half-second she needed, and she was not gentle with it. The man was twice her size, and she went for mechanics instead of strength, joint, leverage, the specific geometry of how a human body fails when you know exactly where to apply pressure. He went down making a sound she didn't wait to hear the end of. Ronan and Silas hit the deck together. Silas was trying to create distance, trying to get to the weapon on his hip, and Ronan held him close because close meant the weapon didn't have an angle. They rolled, and Ronan got a forearm across Silas's throat and bore down, and Silas's face went dark, and his hands came up, and his fingers found Ronan's eyes, and Ronan turned his face into the attack and held on. "Stop," Ronan said through his teeth. "Stop. It's done." Silas did not stop. He bucked and twisted with the focused desperation of a man who understood exactly what happened to him if this moment resolved the wrong way, and Ronan understood it too. And he pressed harder, and Silas's hands went from Ronan's face to the deck, grasping at nothing. "Ronan," Elena's voice, sharp and immediate. He looked up. The man who'd grabbed for Noah had gotten around the crate. He had Noah now, not by the arm, but with a forearm across his chest, lifting him slightly off the deck, and in his other hand was a gun that was pointed at Elena. Ronan went still. Silas stopped moving underneath him. The cargo hold went absolutely quiet, except for the breathing and the sound of the vessel, and the distant harbor noise leaking through the hull. Noah was looking at Ronan. His jaw was set. His hands were at his sides. He was not struggling. He had assessed the situation and understood that struggling was the wrong input at this specific moment, and he'd stopped, and he was waiting, and the patience in it was so familiar it cracked something in Ronan's chest clean through. "The compass," the man with the gun said. Elena had her hand at her jacket pocket. The compass was there, 2 inches from her fingers. Silas said, from the floor, breathing hard but regaining himself, "Give it to him." "Don't," Ronan said. "Ronan." Silas turned his head to look up at him. Blood at the corner of his mouth, coat disheveled, but his eyes were steady as they'd ever been. "Think about what you're choosing." "I know what I'm choosing." "You're choosing your son's life against a dead man's archive." Silas's voice was raw from the pressure, but it still had the shape of reason in it. "Marcus is gone. He made his bet and it failed. You don't have to—" "It didn't fail," Ronan said. "It's standing in this room." He meant Noah. He meant Elena. He meant the compass in her pocket, and the boy with the gray eyes who was waiting, patient, clear-eyed, ready. And he meant something else too, something he didn't entirely have language for, about what his father had actually been trying to build in those last 4 months, and whether Ronan had spent 19 years in the wrong structure entirely. The man with the gun had it leveled at Elena. His arm across Noah tightened. Noah made a small sound, involuntary. Elena's hand moved toward the compass pocket. "Elena, don't," Ronan started. "It's okay," Noah said. His voice was very steady, very small, and very steady, and everyone in the room heard it. He was looking at his mother, not at the man holding him, not at the gun, at his mother. And his expression was the one Ronan had seen on Elena's face a dozen times in the last 24 hours. The expression of someone who'd run the calculation and arrived at an answer they were willing to live inside. "Mom," Noah said, "the compass. I know what it does." Elena went very still. "Grandpa sent it," Noah said. "The letter that came with it. I found it. I read it. I've had it memorized for 2 years. He paused. "I know what I have to do with it." A beat of silence that contained everything. "You read it," Elena said. Not angry, just absorbing. "You kept it in the back of the cookbook. I found it when I was 5. I'm sorry." He wasn't sorry. He was explaining. "The letter said when the time came, I'd know. It said the compass would know, too." He looked at Ronan now. "He wrote about you, Grandpa. He said you'd come eventually." Ronan couldn't speak. He said when you came, the right thing to do would be obvious. Noah's voice was steady, steady, steady. He said it would feel like the end of something, but it was actually just the end of hiding. The man holding him shifted, impatient, and the gun moved slightly toward Ronan. Silas said from the floor, "Sentimental, your father always was." Ronan looked at Silas, at the man he'd trusted with his life for 19 years, at the man who'd sat across from him in rooms and given him counsel and watched his back and had been, the entire time, a building standing over a foundation that was quietly, methodically, patiently rotting from the inside. "Get up," Ronan said. Silas got up slowly. He straightened his coat. He ran a hand over his hair. He reassembled, visibly, because that was what Silas did. He reassembled and he recalibrated and he waited for the next opening. Ronan watched him and felt something settle in him that had been moving for 24 hours. Not peace, something colder and more useful than peace. Clarity. He looked at Elena. He looked at Noah. He looked at the gun. And then the ship shuddered. Not the normal language of metal and water. Something different. A deep concussive thud from somewhere aft. And then immediately the smell of smoke. And the strip lighting along the floor flickered, and one of the overhead lights blew, and they were in half darkness. And the man holding Noah flinched at the sound, and his grip changed, and Noah dropped. He dropped the way someone drops who has been waiting for exactly that kind of disruption, deliberately, trained by gravity and 7 years of a mother who believed in preparation. And he hit the deck and rolled toward the crate and was behind it in 2 seconds and out of the grip entirely. The gun swung toward the sound. Ronan moved. He covered the distance in 3 strides, and the impact drove the man into the container wall, and the gun discharged once into the ceiling. And then Ronan had the gun hand, and he bent it the wrong way, and the weapon clattered to the deck, and the man was done. He turned. Silas was gone. The door to the passageway was open. The smoke smell was thicker now, coming from aft, and there was an orange quality to the light through the porthole at the far end of the hold that hadn't been there before. "Fire," Decker said. He was on his feet. The third man neutralized behind him. "Aft section. Something in the engine compartment." "Silas," Ronan said. "He's heading up." Decker was already moving toward the passageway. "He'll go for a lifeboat, south side." Ronan looked at Elena. She had Noah. She'd gotten to him behind the crate, and she had both arms around him, and he was letting her, his face pressed briefly against her shoulder. And then he straightened and looked at Ronan and said, "Go." "I'm not leaving. Decker will get us out." Noah looked at him with those eyes. "You have to go. He's going to get away." Elena raised her head. Her face was streaked and her hair was loose, and she looked at Ronan the way people look when they've stripped everything back to what's essential. "Go," she said. "We'll be right behind you." He went. The passageway was filling with smoke at the aft end. Thin still, but thickening, and the heat from below was already working through the deck plates underfoot. He went forward and up, toward the main deck, taking the internal stairs 2 at a time, and came out onto the deck into cold air and the smell of burning and the sound of fire somewhere below the waterline, doing what fire does to the things that contain it. The deck was chaos. Silas's remaining men were moving, some toward exits, some uncertain, the fire doing what fear does when it arrives in an organized system. Ronan moved through them without engaging, keeping his eye on the south rail, on the lifeboat station. He saw Silas at the davit. He was already working the release mechanism, the lifeboat swinging outward on its arm, and he saw Ronan coming, and his hands moved faster, and he looked at Ronan across 30 feet of smoke-hazed deck, with an expression that was the first fully honest expression Ronan had ever seen on his face. Not fear. Not exactly. Something adjacent to fear. The look of a man who has, for the first time in a very long time, run out of options and knows it, and whose understanding of that fact has not yet resolved into acceptance. "It's over, Silas," Ronan said. The lifeboat swung clear of the rail. Silas stepped up onto the railing. "Nothing is ever over," Silas said. "You know that. We both know that." And then, from below them, from somewhere aft, the fire found whatever it had been looking for, and the ship shuddered again. Harder this time. A full structural shudder that ran the length of the vessel and threw spray off the water and rang the steel under their feet. And Silas's footing shifted on the railing, and Ronan lunged, and his hand closed on Silas's coat sleeve, and for one suspended second, they were both on the wrong side of the rail with the Black Harbor water 30 feet below them, and the vessel burning around them, and Silas looking at Ronan with that new, honest face. "Let go," Silas said. "Not yet," Ronan said through his teeth, hauling against the coat sleeve, trying to get purchase, the railing biting into his ribs. "Not until you answer one thing." "Ronan, did he know?" His voice cracked on it just once, just at the edge. "At the end. My father. Did he know what you were going to do?" Silas looked at him. The coat sleeve was pulling. The fire below was eating through something structural, and the deck was no longer level, and they were both fighting gravity and the ship's dying motion at the same time. And Silas Kane, who had been reasonable and measured and controlled for 19 years, looked at the man whose father he'd killed and said, quietly, with something in his voice that was too specific to be performed, "He knew. He looked at me when he understood what was happening, and he said your name." The coat sleeve tore, and Silas fell. The water took him, and the dark closed over him, and Ronan hung on the railing with both hands, and the fire roared below him, and he stayed there for 1 second, 2, 3, and then he heard his name from across the deck, and he turned, and there was Elena at the forward hatch with Noah beside her, and Decker behind them, and they were looking at him through the smoke. He got off the railing. He crossed the deck. He walked toward the three of them through the smoke and the noise and the orange light of the burning ship, and Noah took 2 steps toward him and then a third, and Ronan went down on one knee, and his son walked into his arms, and Ronan held him with both hands flat against his back and felt the small, fast heartbeat of him and the way he was breathing, controlled and deliberate, the way his mother breathed when she was frightened. "You okay?" Ronan said into the top of his head. "You keep asking me that," Noah said. "I'm going to keep asking you that." Noah said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "Yeah, I'm okay." Elena's hand found Ronan's shoulder. He looked up at her. She was looking at the water where Silas had gone in, and then she looked at Ronan, and the look between them was too full and too complicated for the vocabulary available, and neither of them tried to reduce it. "We need to move," Decker said. They moved. Down the gangway and along the pier and away from the vessel while it burned behind them, the fire eating through the superstructure now, the harbor glowing orange around it, the first sirens starting in the distance, the city waking up to the sound of something ending. On the dock, Noah stopped and turned back to look at the burning ship. He reached into his own jacket pocket, the inside pocket, the one he'd been pressing his hand against since they'd left the hold, and he took out the compass. Ronan looked at him. "When did you—" "In the hold," Noah said. "When Mom hugged me. I took it from her pocket." He turned the compass over in his hands. The firelight caught the silver surface. "In the letter, Grandpa said the compass knew the way home." He looked up at Ronan. "I think he meant something other than navigation." He held it out to Ronan. Ronan looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Elena. Then he took the compass and closed his hand around it, and the metal was warm from his son's pocket. And somewhere in the harbor behind them, the Callaway Meridian was settling toward the water with all of Silas Kane's patient architecture burning inside it. And the sirens were close now, and the city was fully awake, and everything that came next was going to be harder and stranger and more honest than anything that had come before. Ronan looked at his son. He looked at Elena. He opened his mouth to say something and closed it again because nothing he had was adequate, and adequacy had never been the point anyway. "Walk," Elena said simply. They walked. They found Silas Kane 3 hours later, not in the harbor where the dark water had taken him, on the dock 2 piers south where the current had pushed him against a piling and left him there, coat gone, one shoe gone, breathing in the shallow, irregular way of a man whose body was still running on instinct while the rest of him was trying to decide whether to bother. A Port Authority officer found him first and called it in as an unknown adult male, possible drowning victim, and by the time the paramedics had him on a stretcher, Vera Strand was already on the dock with a badge that was not current and a folder that was, and she made 3 phone calls in the time it took them to load him into the ambulance, and the ambulance had a federal escort before it cleared the pier gate. Ronan heard about it from Vera directly, standing in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner 4 miles from the waterfront, while Elena sat in a booth inside with Noah and 2 cups of hot chocolate that she'd ordered because Noah was cold, and she needed something to do with her hands. He could see them through the window from where he stood. Noah with both hands around the mug, Elena watching him with the concentrated attention of a person who has temporarily given up on the wider world in favor of the one small piece of it that matters most. Alive, Vera said on the phone. In custody. Stable, as of an hour ago. He'll lawyer up before he's out of the ambulance. He will. It won't matter. Her voice had the controlled quality of someone restraining a very specific kind of satisfaction. The archive, Ronan. Once it's accessed and secured, the documentation speaks without him. The case doesn't require his cooperation. The archive isn't accessed yet. No, but we have everything else, the toxicology report, the account trails, the authorization codes on the original cleanup contract. And before you ask, yes, I had the coding system analyzed. The 7-digit prefix with the dash. It's Silas's administrative code, not yours. He built a parallel authorization layer inside your own system. He's been signing off on operations in a structure that looks like yours from the outside and is his from the inside. She paused. If federal investigators had come in without knowing to look for it, they would have found your name. Now they'll know where to look. Ronan stood in the parking lot with the cold coming in off the water and the diner window in front of him and his son's profile behind the glass and said, "What do you need from me?" "A statement, eventually. And the archive when it's ready." She paused again, longer this time. "And Ronan, what you said to Decker before you went to the vessel, about dismantling what remained of the organization. I need that to be real." "It's real. I've heard men say that before." "I know you have." He watched Noah say something to Elena, watched her almost smile in response, the way her whole face moved differently when it was directed at her son. "It's real," he said again. A silence on the line. Then Vera said, "I'll be in touch about the statement," and hung up. He stood there for another minute before he went inside. The diner smelled like coffee and fryer oil and the particular warmth of a room that has been open all night and absorbed everything that's passed through it. He slid into the booth across from Elena and Noah and put his phone on the table and looked at his son, who was watching him over the rim of the mug. "Silas is alive," Ronan said. Elena nodded once, the nod that meant she'd already been working through the implications. "Is he going to be okay?" Noah asked. Ronan looked at him. At the genuine, uncomplicated nature of the question, a 7-year-old asking whether a man who had ordered his death before he was born was going to be physically all right because he was 7 years old and the ethical complexity of it hadn't yet condensed into something his vocabulary could carry. "He's going to be in federal custody," Ronan said carefully. "He's going to have to answer for things he did." Noah considered this. "That's fair," he said. He went back to the hot chocolate. Elena looked at Ronan across the table. She looked tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix quickly. The kind of tired that goes into the tissue, into the bone, that has to be metabolized slowly over weeks of ordinary time. But her eyes were clear, clearer than they'd been since he'd walked into the cafe, he thought. "What happens now?" she said. He told her. The federal case, the statement, the archive, the process of dismantling the organization, not all at once, not recklessly, but structured, accountable. The assets that could be surrendered, surrendered. The operations that could be closed, closed. It would take months. It would require lawyers and cooperation and the particular kind of patience that was different from Silas's patience. Not the patience of someone waiting for power, but the patience of someone doing the work of undoing. He told her about his name on things that shouldn't have had his name, about what that would mean for him, legally, and what Vera had said about the parallel authorization layer, and what the difference was between what he'd done and what had been done in his name, and how blurry that line was going to look from the outside. She listened to all of it. When he was done, she said, "Are you going to go to prison?" "I don't know," he said. "Maybe. For some period of time. Possibly." He held her gaze. "That's the honest answer." She sat with it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. "That's not me saying it doesn't matter. It matters." She wrapped both hands around her own mug. "But you asked me once, or you almost asked me, 7 years ago, the night before I found those documents, whether I could live with knowing what you were, what your life was." She looked at him steadily. I couldn't answer it then. I ran before I had to. You ran because someone tried to kill you. I ran for both reasons, and I've spent 7 years telling myself it was only the one. She looked down at the mug. I'm not running anymore. So, Noah had been listening to the parts of this he could understand and processing the parts he couldn't in the particular internal way of children who are used to adult conversation happening around them. He looked up now and said, without preamble, Are we going to live together? Both adults looked at him. He looked between them with the expression of someone who'd been waiting a reasonable amount of time for a relevant answer and was beginning to lose patience. That's, Elena started. That's a complicated question, Ronan said. It doesn't seem that complicated, Noah said. Elena made the sound that was almost a laugh. Ronan felt something that he hadn't felt in a very long time and didn't fully recognize until it had already been present for several seconds, which was that his chest was not braced for impact. There was no calculation running underneath the moment. He was just sitting in a diner at 7 in the morning with cold air on his jacket and blood he'd washed off his hands in a bathroom sink 2 miles back, across from the woman he'd spent 7 years not allowing himself to think about, and the son he hadn't known he had, and the moment was exactly what it appeared to be. It doesn't seem that complicated, Ronan agreed. Noah went back to his mug, satisfied. The weeks that followed were nothing like the days before them, which was both easier and harder than Ronan had expected. The federal case opened with the kind of institutional momentum that takes years to build and then moves like water finding a drain. Fast, relentless, pulling everything into it. Vera Strand's 3 years of documentation provided the architecture. Ronan's statement provided the interior. He sat in a room with 2 federal attorneys and a stenographer for 11 hours across 3 days and said everything he knew, which was considerable, and everything he'd authorized, which was also considerable, and everything he'd believed he was authorizing versus what Silas had routed through his codes, which was the distinction that the attorneys were most interested in and which took the most time to unspool. He did not make himself smaller in the telling. He did not perform remorse or manufacture it. He answered every question with the same flatness he brought to everything and let the facts occupy the space they occupied. And when the attorneys asked him why he was cooperating fully without a negotiated agreement in place yet, he said, Because my father died trying to do this and I'm finishing it. And neither attorney had a follow-up to that. The archive was accessed 17 days after the night on the vessel. Noah sat at a table in a federal facility with Ronan beside him, and Elena 2 chairs down, and Vera Strand across the room, and a technician placed the compass in a reader that Marcus Viscari's attorney had provided, along with 6 pages of instructions that Marcus had written by hand and sealed 14 months before his death. The compass opened, literally, physically opened, along a seam that was invisible until it wasn't, the case separating to reveal a circuit embedded in the casing. And Noah placed his thumb on the surface the way the instructions described, and a 12-digit code populated on the technician's screen, and the encrypted archive unlocked. 347 files, 22 years of documentation, names, transactions, communications, chain of custody records for evidence that Marcus Viscari had been assembling with the methodical care of a man who understood that he might not live to present it himself. Ronan sat in that room and watched the files populate on the screen and thought about his father at 61, at his desk on a Tuesday morning, looking up and understanding what was happening and saying a name. His son's name. Not in the hope of rescue, just because it was the word he had left. He pressed his hands flat on the table and breathed. Noah's hand appeared next to his on the table. Small, deliberate, just there. Ronan turned his hand over, and his son's hand settled into his palm, and they sat like that while the screen filled with 22 years of his father's last act, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. The arrests came over the following 6 weeks, in waves. A federal judge in Portland who'd been clearing cases for the organization for 11 years. 2 state legislators. A Port Authority commissioner who'd been managing vessel documentation for Silas's cargo operation. The leadership of 3 other crime families, pulled in through the account trails that Marcus's documentation mapped with the thoroughness of someone who'd understood that incomplete evidence was worse than none. They came in quietly, mostly, The kind of people who'd spent careers insulating themselves from public spectacle were not inclined toward it when the spectacle was against them. Silas Kane was charged with 31 counts across 4 jurisdictions. The murder of Marcus Vescari. The solicitation of murder for hire, twice. Elena's name and Noah's on the original contract. And a second contract that Vera's investigation had uncovered. A contingency order placed 18 months ago against Vera herself, which had not been executed but which had been paid for, and the payment trail was clean and complete and unambiguous. He did not cooperate. He sat in a detention facility in a suburb south of the city and met with his attorneys and said nothing publicly and continued to not say anything, which was his right, and also, given the quality of the documentation against him, entirely beside the point. Ronan's own legal situation resolved over 4 months of negotiation that he was not present for most of, his attorneys managing the architecture of it while he did the other work. The dismantling, the surrender of assets, the process of closing the financial structures that the organization had used for 2 decades and replacing them with nothing. The federal attorneys had used the phrase substantial cooperation, and the judge, when the time came, used the phrase mitigating circumstances and demonstrated remediation, and the sentence was 18 months, and Ronan had already accepted this before it was given. He told Elena the night before the sentencing, in the kitchen of the house in Ravenna that had become something different over those months. Less a safe house and more just a house, with Noah's drawings on one wall of the kitchen and a coffee maker Elena had brought from the cafe and a particular quality of morning light through the east window that Ronan had started noticing without deciding to. She took the news the way she took most things, with stillness first and then with the movement that replaced stillness, which in this case was getting up and standing at the window with her back to him for a long moment. 18 months, she said. Yes. That's... She stopped, started again. That's not forever. No. That's not nothing either. No, he said. It's not. She turned around. Her face had done the thing it did when she'd finished the internal argument and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. He's going to ask why, she said. Noah, you know that. I know. What are you going to tell him? Ronan thought about this, about how to say true things to a 7-year-old who ran the way he did and watched hands instead of faces and had read a letter he wasn't supposed to find and memorized it in 2 years because he understood somehow that it would matter. I'm going to tell him that his grandfather spent the last months of his life trying to make something right that had been wrong for a long time, and that I didn't finish it when I should have, and that the 18 months is what finishing it costs. He paused, and that the cost is worth it. Elena looked at him for a long time. Is that true? She asked. Not challenging, actually asking. Every part of it, he said. She nodded, came back to the table and sat down and put her hand on the table between them, not reaching for his hand, just placing it there, available. And he put his hand over hers and they sat in the kitchen with the evening coming in through the window and the sound of Noah in the next room doing something that involved periodic thumping and occasional narration of whatever game he was playing, and they didn't talk for a long time. The morning Ronan reported to the federal facility, Noah was up before dawn. He was in the kitchen when Ronan came downstairs, sitting at the table in his pajamas with a bowl of cereal he wasn't eating, watching the door with the expression of someone who'd set an alarm for a specific purpose and was not going to be talked out of it. Ronan sat down across from him. They looked at each other. Mom explained it, Noah said. I know she did. You have to go because of what you did before, not what you did now. He said it with the careful precision of someone repeating back information they've been given and are testing against their own understanding. Before isn't the same as now. That's right. But you still have to go because before happened. Yes. Noah absorbed this. He picked up his spoon and put it down. Grandpa died because of Silas, he said. And you had things happening under your name that weren't you. But some of them were you. Ronan didn't look away. Some of them were me. And the 18 months is for the some of them were you part. Yes. Noah looked at his cereal, then he looked up. Okay, he said. Okay? I don't think it's okay. He frowned slightly, working it. But I understand it. And I know you're coming back, and you explained it instead of making something up." He paused. "Dad used to be made up. I mean, you used to be made up. Mom said you were gone because things were complicated, which was true, but also she couldn't tell me the real thing because the real thing was dangerous." He looked at Ronan with those gray eyes that had been looking at him for 7 months now, and still landed with the same weight. "I like the real thing better, even when it's hard." Ronan pressed his hands flat on the table and looked at his son and felt the thing he had no name for, that had been building since a small boy walked out of a kitchen and stood between his mother and 3 strangers without flinching, and it sat in his chest now like something permanent. "So do I," he said. Elena drove him. Noah sat in the back and didn't talk much, which was unlike him. But when they pulled up to the facility and Ronan got out and opened the back door, Noah got out too and stood on the sidewalk in his jacket and looked at the building and then at Ronan. He held out his hand. The gesture was formal and very serious, the handshake of a child who'd decided this was the appropriate register for the moment. And Ronan took his hand and shook it, and Noah's grip was firm and brief, and then he let go and stepped back. "I'm going to learn to make the sourdough while you're gone," he said. "The real way. So when the cafe opens again, we have it." "The cafe is opening again?" Noah looked at him like this was obvious. "Mom already signed the new lease, different location, better kitchen." He glanced at Elena, who was leaning against the car with her arms crossed and her expression doing the complicated thing it did when she was trying not to let something show. "She said it's not a hiding place this time. She said it's just ours." Ronan looked at Elena. She looked back at him. She uncrossed her arms and came to stand in front of him on the sidewalk, and the morning light was coming in flat and clear from the east, and it was cold enough that her breath showed. 18 months, she said. 18 months, he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment. Everything they hadn't said and had said, and would still have time to say, was in the look, and neither of them tried to compress it into words because some things are accurately carried only in the space between 2 people standing close to each other in the cold. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the compass and held it out to him. He looked at it. "I can't take that in." "I know. I want you to hold it for a second." She paused. "Your father made this. He put everything he had left into a plan and he trusted it to people who didn't even know each other yet, and he died before he knew if any of it worked." She looked at the compass in his hand. "I used to think keeping it safe was a burden. It felt like carrying someone else's hope that I hadn't agreed to carry." Her voice was even, but it had weight in it. "Now I think he knew something we didn't, about what would come out of all of this if it worked." Ronan looked at the compass. The silver surface caught the morning light, and he could see, now that he knew to look, the seam in the casing, the place where it opened, the place his son had pressed his thumb. "He said your name," Ronan said. "At the end. That's what Silas told me." Elena was quiet. "I think he was talking to you too," Ronan said. "Even though you'd never met. He sent you the compass. He trusted you with it. I think when he was sitting there at the end saying my name, I think he meant both of us. The whole thing he was trying to build." She took the compass back from him, closed her fingers around it. "Go in," she said. Her voice was steady. "We'll be here when you come out." He nodded, looked at Noah, who was standing a few feet away with his hands in his pockets and his chin up, holding himself with the particular composure of someone who'd decided to model the behavior he wanted to see. Ronan put his hand briefly on his son's shoulder. Noah reached up and covered it with his own hand for exactly 1 second, and then they both let go. He walked in. The 18 months moved the way long time moves when you are present in it, slowly in the individual days and then faster in the larger arc, the weeks becoming identifiable only by what changed inside them. He had a small room, books, a window with a fixed view of a parking lot, and a strip of sky above it. He wrote things down. Not a journal, not exactly, but a running account of what he remembered and what he needed to remember and what he owed to the remembering. He wrote about Marcus, about the offshore audit and the things his father had found and the decision his father had made in the last 4 months of his life. He wrote about Silas, with as much honesty as he could sustain, which meant acknowledging the ways he'd chosen not to see things he could have seen, and the ways the organization had operated that he'd allowed because they were profitable, and he hadn't looked directly at the human cost of them. He wrote about Elena, not in detail, just the outline of what had been there, and what running from it had cost them both, and what the 7 years had built in her that he hadn't been present for and would have to learn at the pace she allowed. He wrote about Noah, often. The way the boy held a spoon. The way he'd read a letter he wasn't supposed to find and kept it for 2 years and said nothing because he'd decided at 5 years old that the information was for later. Where he'd gotten that from was a question that answered itself. Elena brought Noah to visit when the schedule allowed, which was monthly. They sat across a table in a visitation room, and Noah talked about the cafe. The new location had opened 4 months into Ronan's sentence, a corner space on Dexter Avenue with bigger windows and a kitchen that actually had room to move in, and about school and about the sourdough, which had been a partial success and then a better success, and was now, according to Noah, the best thing on the menu, which Elena confirmed with the look of someone who'd eaten enough of it to have an informed opinion. Ronan listened to his son describe the mechanics of fermentation with the focused enthusiasm of a child who had decided this was important and was not going to move on until the importance was fully communicated, and felt the thing he had no name for, which was now familiar enough that he'd stopped trying to name it. It was just there, permanent, the feeling of having something to come back to. On the day he walked out, it was raining. Seattle in spring was less punishing than November. The rain was lighter, the kind that felt like weather rather than a verdict, but it came down steadily, and the parking lot outside the facility was wet and reflected the overcast sky in long silver puddles. They were there. Elena was parked at the far end of the lot, standing outside the car in her rain jacket, because she'd apparently decided against sitting inside, and Noah was beside her in the yellow jacket he'd had for 2 years and refused to stop wearing because it still fit, and they were both watching the door when he came through it. Ronan stopped on the steps. He looked at them across the parking lot, at Elena with her arms not crossed for once, just at her sides, and at his son who'd seen him first and was already moving, not running, walking with great deliberate purpose, as if running would misrepresent the seriousness of the occasion. Ronan went down the steps. They met in the middle of the parking lot in the light rain, and Noah's arms went around his waist and held on, and Ronan put both hands flat on his son's back and felt him breathing, and the rain came down on them, and none of it mattered. After a moment, Noah stepped back and looked up at him with the same expression he'd had at the table the morning Ronan left. Serious, assessing, taking inventory. "The sourdough got better," he said. "You said it was already the best thing on the menu." "It got better than that." Elena arrived beside them. She looked at Ronan in the rain with the clear eyes that had been looking at him for 17 months across a table in a visitation room, and everything else she'd been looking at him with for the last 7 years. And everything before that, too. The full length of knowing him, damage and all, intact and unrevised. She reached into her jacket pocket. She held out the compass. "Yours now," she said. He looked at it. "It was never mine." "Marcus made it. It's Vescari. That's yours." She waited. "Noah says you should carry it. He says Grandpa would have wanted you to have it now that it's done what it was supposed to do." Ronan looked at his son. Noah shrugged, with the mild expression of someone whose reasoning is self-evident. Ronan took the compass. He turned it over once in his palm. The silver surface, the invisible seam, the small and impossible weight of it. He put it in his jacket pocket. Elena looked at him for one more moment, that full and uncatalogued look, and then she said, "Come on." Noah promised Decker he'd bring lunch, and Decker gets particular about his lunch hour. "Decker is working at the cafe?" "He suggested it. I said the kitchen was smaller than he was used to." She started toward the car. "He said he'd manage." "He manages." Noah fell in beside Ronan as they walked. "He's actually good at the prep work," Noah said. "He's very precise." "He is," Ronan agreed. "He doesn't talk much." "No." "I like that about him." They reached the car. Elena had already gotten in, was starting the engine, and through the window Ronan could see the steam of her breath and the particular way she held the wheel. Both hands, practical, ready. Noah went around to the passenger side and got in and immediately started telling Elena something about a thing that had happened at school that morning, and his voice carried easily through the car's small space, and the car filled with it. Ronan stood for one moment in the rain with his hand in his jacket pocket and his fingers around the compass, which was already warming to his body heat, which was already starting to feel like something he'd carried a long time. Then he opened the door and got in. The car was warm and smelled like coffee and Noah's jacket, that particular smell of a child who has been outdoors and carried it back inside with him. And Elena pulled out of the parking lot without ceremony, and they drove toward the city, which was gray and rainy and full of the ordinary noise of itself, and nobody said anything for a few minutes because nothing needed to be said. Then Noah, from the front seat, without turning around, said, "The cafe opens at 7, but we close early on Sundays now. Mom said we could do Sunday mornings differently." "Differently how?" Ronan said. "Together." He said it simply, like it was the most unremarkable thing. "We didn't really get to do that before." Ronan looked out the window at the city going past, at the streets he'd moved through for 20 years under different conditions than these. Faster, more armored, with the particular forward-locked vision of someone who doesn't look sideways because what's sideways doesn't serve the destination. The city looked the same and looked different, the way everything looks different when you are looking at it instead of through it. "No," he said. "We didn't." "So now we will," Noah said. Elena glanced in the rearview mirror. Their eyes met for 1 second, and she looked back at the road, and she was not quite smiling, but something close to it. The expression that lived in the neighborhood of a smile that was more specific than happiness. That was the face of a person who has survived something and is still here and has decided, actively and without illusion, to be here fully. Ronan leaned his head back against the seat. Outside, Seattle moved around them. The streets wet and silver and unremarkable. The buildings going about the business of being buildings. The ordinary morning of an ordinary city where nothing visible had changed, and where, in a corner space on Dexter Avenue with bigger windows and a kitchen that actually had room to move in, a cafe was waiting to open, with sourdough that had become better than the best thing on the menu and walls that had not yet had time to accumulate their scars. The compass sat warm in his pocket. His son was talking again, about something else now, moving on to the next thing the way 7-year-olds move, all forward motion and unencumbered topic shifts, and the complete lack of irony that belongs only to people who haven't yet learned to perform their own sincerity. Ronan listened. The car moved through the city. The rain came down, lighter now, almost finished, and somewhere behind the overcast the morning was continuing to brighten the way mornings do. Not dramatically, not all at once, just steadily. The gray becoming less gray. The light finding its way through in the unremarkable and sufficient way that light always does, given enough time and nothing left blocking it.